The thing I want to talk about today is the life cycle of the Active Directory from a service or server perspective and server perspective, to be precise. The life cycle of identities, a user account, a service account, anything that is sort of built upon the AD, and how attacks are crossing this, sort of these cycles. And the main message I want to convey here is, how do you embed preparation and prevention into these life cycles so that if there is something happening to you, you're not sort of unprepared. You have sort of made your way, you've thought it in advance, you thought of it in advance, because that will help you to sort of tackle what is a big topic in current regulations, Cyber Resilience Act, NIST². They're talking about risk management and cyber resilience in that sense. So, for me to do so, allow me to set the scene, to correlate things, to correlate today's cyber challenges with other topics, with the life cycles of your AD, with the life cycles of identities, and as well with, as I mentioned it in the title, with NIST², NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2. Today's cyber challenges briefly go through securing all identities. I mean, privileged account, service account, user account, local or domain joint. There is a lot of things going on with identities. We are focused on identities as we are trying to give least amount of privileges to our users, least amount of privileges just in time to our administrators. They are yours. They are your users. They are created in the context of what you are doing within your organization, the business your business processes you do. And that's a challenge in itself. Protecting the AD, so you see already the connection. We have the identities on the AD and we have to protect the AD itself, is, whether you call it Active Directory or Entra or Azure AD, whoever came up there with the idea to call it Entra, nobody does that. At least I'm trying to avoid it. Is one of the major, if not the dominant, directory services we have. You can talk about LDAP or something like that. Protecting that one is a must. Someone familiar with the case of the logistic giant Maersk? That's an interesting story. If they find a disabled AD backup somewhere in Nigeria, get it to Denmark to restore the whole thing, isn't it? Funny thing itself. Achieve and maintain compliance. I already mentioned it. NIST², DORA, CRA, whatever is to come up in the near future, there is no single sector or no single org that is not affected by any sort of internal compliance mandate or external sector-related compliance mandate or any sort of legal requirement. So it is a cyber challenge. And the final two are mitigating ransomware threats, broader perspective, malware threats. Not everything is encrypted nowadays, but at least you're extorted. And the control of access to sensitive data. If you go through the control of access to sensitive data, give me a second here, you have to think of it as the prime target for those guys rendering these threats to you. They want to have your data. They want to use it for their own purposes. They want to extort you on their access to the data. And that's in itself a challenge, not only in the face of attackers, but also in how do you organize yourself? Who has what kind of rights to see data internally? Your financial statements, your HR data, your intellectual property, the way things are developed inside your organization. whatever that is. And not forgetting about mitigating the malware threats, I think we have heard a lot about threat landscape, how it will likely evolve, what Miko said today in the morning, and how vulnerabilities will evolve. Coming back to Alex's talk, keynote today. And in all fairness, and in a short statement, my 2 cents is we will have work to do. A lot of work. That's why a framework, NIST 2, is potentially helpful. Because, important note to the asterisks, it's still in draft mode. It's expected to be released or published as the final in probably April next year. Let's say beginning of 2024, let's say April. But overall, NIST is a guide to help you to structure your approach, to organize your approach, how you run your security operations. If you're not familiar with it, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover are the existing elements, pillars of NIST. Govern will be added to it. And in sort of very brief terms, identify, know what you have. In and out. Users, systems, servers, services, connections, networks, whatever it is there. Protect what you have. Make sure it is safe. Harden it. Detect, know what is going on in the IT estate. What is changing? New users, new systems, new services. You can go through that in a cycle in itself. Respond. What happens if you detect something malicious? Oops, sorry, my mistake. Detect and respond are sort of interactive to each other. If something malicious happens, take care of it. Yeah, but how do you know that is something malicious? So you have to detect it. Recover is quite simple on the one hand side. On the other hand side, quite often misunderstood. Coming back to cyber resilience in that sense. If you are talking about recovery in terms or in the context of business continuity and disaster recovery, you're falling short. Recovery is more than that. Recovery is to be back in a state that you're operational, that is relying on business continuity, that is relying on disaster recovery, but is more so relying on your employees to be able to execute their tasks with a set of limited resources or no digital resources at all for a limited time. If we're talking about the new version, the draft version, which includes govern, there is a lot of things that they have come up with to say, okay, increase the guidance on how to implement each of these pillars, including governance. There is a lot of implementation examples that are added to provide notional ways of doing things that are there to have a glimpse on action-oriented processes. There's a lot of things. They emphasize, and that's the new part, governance as a little bit of a difficulty here. Still works? Good. Okay. The new function govern is added because of its to address organizational context. And that's the link again to cyber resilience. Yeah? If you are putting IT security operations without any context to the business operations, you might be following best practices. You might be following things like a security architecture that is sort of a best read in your sector. But if it's still decoupled from your business processes, if you're overshooting security for that least important business process while neglecting the high level of security of your most core important business processes. You're doing it for the sake of security, but not for the sake of the business. Therefore, there is an emphasis for cybersecurity supply chain risk management in the new draft. There is also a clarification for the understanding of cybersecurity measurement and assessment. And that all comes back to that point of how do I govern my cybersecurity? How do I put this together that it makes sense for my business? That's the difference between following best practices and switching off your brain, sorry, had to bring that, or doing it for the sake of your own organization. Measured approach to cybersecurity. So, after talking about NIST, let's talk about the Active Directory lifecycle in two layers. AD for me, coming from a technical background, I was once a Cisco certified security professional. I'm always looking at these layers in terms of what is there from a server, hardware, operating system perspective, what is there from a data perspective, and then we come to the final lifecycle, which is identity. What's the usage lifecycle for the things we do with that stuff? So AD Server OS, quite simple. Install. Do it from known good sources. As simple and sort of commonality as it sounds, you quite often see that things are not sourced from reliable sources, that they are sort of, hey, here's your CD, download it from there or whatever. Make sure that you have known good sources for that. It's needless to say, I guess. Configure, harden it, use best practices. Yeah, I've sort of gossiped about best practices, but they have a play. Yeah? Think of best practice as the way NIST and CIS, the Center for Internet Security, with their benchmarks put it. Yeah? It's a sort of good average among all sizes of organizations, among all sectors of businesses that are applied to you. If you're a 500 employee organization, the same best practice should be used by a 10,000 employee organization, which tells you that there are things in there that might not be good enough for you, or that might hamper you or block you from doing things in a more efficient way. With that in mind, if you use that best practice to come up, and then you move over to maintain and support, and I will explain the difference. Maintain means you have started with that best practice, CIS benchmark for Microsoft Active Directory, for example, and then you maintain it by saying, okay, now I have it in a operational state. Now I can make sure that all the services I have disabled on the Microsoft Windows Server installation, I can use that as a baseline, and I can monitor, detect the changes to it. If you're talking about support and maintenance, the maintenance, whenever a change happens due to maintenance, expected planned work, this is planned, you can reconcile that, whatever is going on. Support is something unexpected is happening, and you need to respond to that. And over time, you will see that match between these phases and the steps and how that goes into the life cycles, the mindset behind that. When we're talking about the data life cycle, keep in mind that we're talking about data groups, so the whole structure of it. Not identities now, not individual users now. We're talking about how do you group your users? How do you put policies in there? How do you put distribution lists in there? You create them. Establish why a group or a distribution list is in there. Why do you need that? For what purpose do you need that? Document these factors that led to its creation. And then when you go into use and expire and renew and delete, you still have a fallback. You can still refer to that. This is why we did it originally. Do we still serve that purpose? And use, simple as it is, when it is in use, beware of the AD's data usage. Changes to the group rights, for example. Who has mandated that change? Monitor that. Expire and renew. This is a tricky thing in AD policies and group policies and data is always, how do we expire it? How do we renew it? How do we get to the point of, can we delete it? Often people are afraid to delete stuff from the AD because they have lost connection to the first site. So, if you have used something, in any case, there will be a time where you consider to take a group, a policy, a distribution list out of service. You want to take it out of operation to expire it or to have a reason to renew it. And this is the cycle, that's why it's a little bit of change in there, that you have to have a process in place in that life cycle of AD data to say, is this still good enough for me? Does it really resemble my organization? Because that's the whole idea of Active Directory in itself. It should be a digital representation of your organizational structure. And if you change your organizational structure and you don't follow with your AD, you're losing track of it. You're opening holes for the attackers to misuse that. Simply because, do we really do this anymore? I don't know, I'm unsure, maybe don't touch it. You know all these kind of stories why things haven't been followed up. And finally, talking about the life cycles, talking about identities. Onboard, manage, communicate, analyze, offboard. I'm new to the team. Hey, can I get my account? You know that. Yeah? By the way, Microsoft itself has a different setup. They are talking about 3 steps: join, move, leave, when talking about identity lifecycle. I am pretty sure that with, as we're talking along CSF and AD lifecycle, that these 3 steps may be a little bit too generic. Simply because you need to emphasize governance. You need to have this connection to your business processes, to your actual being as an organization. So user onboarding or provisioning is the process of integrating new people into the organization's infrastructure. Long sentence. Creating new user accounts in the AD, granting them the necessary rights and access to what they would need to perform their duties. If you are considering sort of the HR-driven use case here is, okay, they signed up a new employee, they want to have that sort of reflected in what is assigned to that user. You can do it by group membership, you can do it by roles. And of course, that's the connection to AD or the connection between AD and identities. The second step, user management. Keeping user properties and permissions up to date. User information, user access rights, user roles, user responsibilities, and privileges. In itself, task. In itself, a daunting task, because when you have local groups, group nesting, access control, what else? Let's say several people managing the same account, several people looking at how groups are interacting with each other. inherited access via group management. There is a lot of complexity in user management in itself, which leads to communicate. In today's, our world, where we are dependent on interaction, on remote interaction, on communication in itself, it is vital that departments and teams in your organization can do that in order to accomplish their tasks. And therefore, this sort of communication management, these tools like MS Teams, depending on these identities and the way they are structured to each other, is an element of user lifecycle management, because it ensures that users are part of the right groups and that the groups can fulfill what they do. So managing them in terms of what is the kind of access rights, what are the kind of privileges they have, is the first step. If you then start using that, you're actually going into the fourth step, which is analytics. Extensive analytics of what's going on in your users and groups. Not only from a security perspective, but overall, the security is a side note to it, in that sense, in that perspective, that you have the ability to say, okay, I can establish group membership, I can sort of point my users to the things that they need to have in place so that they can effectively work, and I can manage that, I can analyze any shortcomings, which will also help me to deprovision or offboard a certain user. As you can see, we have these sort of columns, and when preparing that slide set, I was actually saying, okay, can I condense that in terms of using a word for each of these columns? Leave governance aside. Didn't really work out for me, so you have to live with that layers. Now to the opposite. And you remember that I was starting the presentation with the word of saying, okay, let's look at the life cycles and how they are crossed from an attacker's point of view. And one of the best visualization of an attack path, or the phases and stages and the initial elements and what is done during these phases, is from the CERT in New Zealand. You can find it on their website, and they are very elaborate about it. Initial access, consolidation, preparation, impact on target. You have heard the terms. Phishing. Phishing leads to valid credentials. You can also do password guessing. That leads to valid credentials. Therefore, you can log into Internet Exposed Services. RDP. As my dear friend and colleague Martin Canard is always using RDP as the abbreviation for Ransomware Distribution Protocol. He's not wrong in that. Exploit a vulnerability. Who was listening and or reading and following up on the latest Cisco story? Cisco ISC². Huh? Interesting. Still don't know where this has to do. Huh? It's still unclear. Thousands of devices probably being compromised, but we don't know what is the final target. What's the final aim of what they want to achieve? What should be their impact on the target? It's going to be fun. Email, malicious document, malware, command and control. When you look at this stuff here, you see password guessing, phishing, valid credentials, privilege escalation, lateral movement, getting to the data, where data is also sort of the context of my today's session about the data on your ID, DC sync, ELSA stamp, and stuff like that. So if I rephrase that to put the put the identities first, you have compromised credentials and standing privileges as the forefront of what is happening with identities, with your AD, with the privileges you have, with the users you have, with the service accounts you have. Yeah? I'm not forgetting about exploiting vulnerabilities, configuration, and security weaknesses. For the sake of my presentation today, we're focusing on identities. And the attacks crossing identity and AD lifecycles, we are in that core block. Did I have a weak configuration of my AD server? Do I have properly maintained it? Do I really respond to unexpected support, whatever cases, unexpected incidents? Do I properly use the groups I have? Am I good in exploration and updating these stuff? Do I manage the access rights? Do I manage the communication? Do I really analyze what's going on? So if you have preparation and prevention, if I'm really talking about governance in this part, the more I know why I was doing something, the better I am in executing all these tasks, the better I am in detecting unwanted, potentially malicious activity along all the 3 life cycles, and the better I am in responding to them. So don't underestimate governance. As a primer, and the onset of the talk was to have a sort of a blueprint, and good for all of us, I'm already ahead of time in terms of my slide. The primer of security and governance questions to ask. One line is missing. To ask whom? Yourself, your organization, your peers. Don't forget the exchange we have today. The things you learn today, the listening you do today, the thinking of what was that and is it really helpful? For having an architecture and a tool chain that can deliver the answers to those questions, which, when you act on them, they will help you to be more resilient, to be better, more resilient, to be better in your resilience, to, and sort of sidestep here, the University of Stockholm coined the sort of best definition I can find about cyber resilience. It's the ability of an organization to continuously deliver results despite adverse cyber events. And that's the 2 things. Deliver results despite the event. The focus is not on cybersecurity in itself. And that's always, in my point, in my perspective, in my view, a sort of a source of misunderstanding when they talk about cyber resilience, that they focus on cyber. By the way, resilience is adapt, anticipate, absorb. Adapt to the cyber realities, anticipate any new things, like we've heard from Mika and Alex today in the morning. Anticipate automation on the attacker side, anticipate the release of vulnerabilities, like they both said. And then you have why and how are our accounts created and organized? Can you answer that question? My org can't. We're still working on that one. Why? Which accounts pose a risk and why? We're good in that. Is AD in a vulnerable state? Probably not. And you can go through these questions, and if you find good answers to them, and if you have a good handle for it, if you can really explain it to yourself, and if you can explain it to others, that you know why an account was created and how it was created. If The creation is tied to a defined business activity, and on and on. Unused accounts are identified and destroyed as a mandate in your internal policy, for example. You have a good handle, a sort of a primer, a blueprint of questions you can ask to improve your AD security, to improve the life cycles of AD as a server, AD as data, and identities you have in your time. Okay. Allow me a few final slides. Talking about Netflix a little bit. We have tools for that. You can find the names in the solution or in the slide set. We have about 10 minutes left. Here we go for questions. If you don't have any questions, we are early for coffee. Come on, that's fun. Yeah? Maybe we want that. Or maybe we meet and discuss further outside with a coffee in our hand. I'll thank you.